So if you're familiar with my channel, you'll notice that I talk a lot about this great cinder block called Atlas Shrugged. Already I've made 6 videos on this book, but I wanted to make one more, explaining why I hold this book in such high esteem. Well, I like to go to a lot of thrift stores, and on one of my trips, I was able to pick up this copy of the book. The main thing that interested me in this book was a very famous rumor. It has been said that the director of BioShock based a lot of the story off of Atlas Shrugged. I was a fan of BioShock, and I wanted to give it a go. And plus, picking this gigantic book up for 80 cents, yeah, I could do a lot worse than that. This was back in what I like to call the BC era, before COVID. Since I had a lot less time back then, I mostly just sat on this book for a while. But when COVID did strike, 2 very big things happened. The first, I started to renew my love of reading. Mostly because when you got a whole lot of time on your hands, it's one of the best ways to be able to eat up said time. And that leads to the second point as well. In addition to the reading, I was doing a fair bit of philosophy, I guess you could say, a fair bit of soul searching, because that's when I started to question if I was really transgender or not. By the time I did get around to reading this book, I had just come out to my mother, as well as a few close friends. My mom thought I was just joking about the whole thing, and my friends, they were a little iffy, but they were leaning more towards the acceptance side of things, thankfully. That was the environment that I first started to get into this book. Now here's one of the crazy things for you. I originally started reading this book as I just ordered 3 Bond books offline, and I just something to do while I was waiting for them. Suffice to say, I was still reading this book by the time all 3 of those arrived. When I first started reading Atlas Shrugged, I was expecting a sci-fi action epic, much like how BioShock was. What I got instead, though, was very different. It was this great overarching mystery throughout most of the book, as well as some very interesting characters and philosophies. That was one of the things I found so interesting as people talk about villains or characters that are larger than life. In this book, I very much found the characters to be life-sized. As in, these are people that could exist and probably do exist. So as I've alluded to calling this a cinder block, it is a very big book. In fact, when I first reviewed it, I did a 2-parter, because I knew I was not going to be able to review all this in one go. That, and I just read parts 1 and 2. In part 3 is where the answer to the mystery was, and I didn't want such a thing to be spoiled to people that were just picking this book up for the first time. And on top of that, I was just enjoying the book so much, I wanted to get the word out there about how fantastic it was. But the main reason I bring that up is because summarizing this book is just about as tough a task as Atlas is to be able to hold up the entire world. So instead, I'm going to summarize what I got out of it. The first big thing was the character of Dagny Taggart. The way she was described is very much how I wanted to be when I started transitioning. Very much feminine, beautiful, but also somebody you don't want to mess with. And on top of that, it was nice that she was also a brunette, like me. Although I do not understand how this one detail was completely wrong in all 3 of the movies. I also admired how direct she was. This was something I very much wanted to be at the time, and well, I guess even to some extent I want to be a very direct person today as well. And the other big thing was just her general spirit. Her, as well as I, are the kind of people that if you tell us we can't do something, we'll just simply go, watch me. And that goes hand in hand with her inability to give up, which I very much see in myself. Although it was kind of hilarious. There were a few spots in the book where I'm just like, why don't you just give up? And then I would pause and be like, wait, if I was in her same situation, I wouldn't have given up either. I would have kept going. The second big thing was the John Galt line. At least that's the way I pronounce it. I've heard some people say Galt. But regardless, the thing that stuck out to me the most is the idea that everywhere Dagny turned, she was being denied to be able to commission this. She went to the Scientific Institute, and no one there wanted to say that Reardon metal was actually safe. She went to the president of Haggard Transcontinental, and he denied it. And then, when things finally started to get going, the engineers union said they would never send an engineer to ride on that train. Which she said she was going to drive herself if need be. And through all the trials and tribulations, she managed to make that stretch of railroad using Reardon metal. And through that, she went from somebody who's willing to throw people's lives away to a hero. I very much drew parallels between the John Galt line and me continuing the journey of transitioning. It very much felt like as impossible of a task. And the main thing I got out of that was people hate responsibility. That is how she was able to do this. She ignored the advice of the scientific community. When James refused a commission to be able to build this line, she separated or made her own company, basically saying, hey, if this thing backfires, you blame me. This is my fault. This has nothing to do with Taggart Transcontinental. And very much the same thing with the engineers. She wanted to show everybody the miracle of Reardon metal. And in my case, I wanted to show everybody the miracle of transitioning. And that was very much how I did it. This is my problem. I wasn't going to make it anybody else's unless they made it my problem. It was my responsibility. I wanted to come up with the protocols. I wanted to make sure everybody knew what had to be done for such a thing. And if there was a problem, it was my problem. It was not on the responsibility of anybody else. And so with that, I think people started to realize that I wasn't doing this just to show off. I was just doing this because I just genuinely felt happier this way. And just like Dagny, I was able to get quite a few people to support me in my little crusade, if you prefer. The third thing that stuck out to me was Hank Reardon's living situation. He lived with a wife, as she said on multiple occasions, that was just marrying him for the fame rather than the love. Also in that house, he lived with his deadbeat brother-in-law as well as his mother-in-law, both of which are just staying at the house mostly because of the mother-in-law's guilt. During the course of the story, Hank bumps into Francisco de Nancia. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. It's been a few years since I last read the book. He gave some very sound advice. He says, if people are using guilt to control you, then stop feeling guilty. You'll notice that all of a sudden they don't have a weapon to fight with anymore. And by the end of the book, Hank takes advantage of this advice. He divorces his wife to somebody who actually loves him for who he is. He kicks out his deadbeat brother-in-law and also kicks the mother-in-law to the curb as well. This, in a ways, was very much parallel to my life. My parents have often used guilt as a means to be able to control me. In such a thing as transitioning, there was no exception as well. My mother at this point was starting to come around to being a little more accepting, but she couldn't ignore the fact that occasionally there'd be letters coming in under my new name. And every so often she would come up to me and say, what if your dad would ever find out about this? To which I was just like, good. He needs to know. I need to tell him. And this is the best way to be able to bring up such a conversation. She didn't really like that answer, but she had no other weapons to be able to argue with, so she just let it go. Eventually, I did manage to find the courage to be able to tell him. And his reaction was just, oh, okay. Which, knowing him, I knew it had to mean either one of two things. Either he was really accepting about this, or it was just slowly eating him up inside and he was just putting on a brave face for everyone around him. And so, about a month or two later, I found out he was just putting on a brave face. He found my hormone replacement therapy, and he was none too happy about that. We had a very intense discussion about that. Just like my mother, he was using guilt here and there, and even throwing in a few other things. Basically saying, well, you like girls, are you going to be able to find anybody this way? And the other big one, he was very much convinced that the doctor I was seeing was brainwashing me, simply telling everything I wanted to hear because they wanted my insurance money. Once again, this was a very heated discussion. By the end of it, I was just like Hank Reardon with all those other relatives. I just had enough. I told him off. I said, I don't care what you think. This makes me happy, and I'm going to keep doing it whether you like it or not. Which he ended it saying, alright, well, I'll just ignore this then. But what about the other relatives? Well, I'm going to tell all the other relatives, okay? Well, then I'm just going to keep ignoring this. And even to this day, he's still doing it. But I very much agree with Francisco's advice. However, I do say that from the position that I was getting all the paperwork finished on moving into a house at that point, so even if he did kick me out, I would still have somewhere to go, so it's hard to say how well that advice would be able to help other people in their journey. In all of Ein's writings, there is very much this theme of being true to yourself. To do things because they make you happy, not because they make other people happy. A lot of people would dismiss this theology and call it, well, selfish. And yeah, that's definitely true, but for not the reason that you would think. The best example I would give is, imagine you made like a very big dinner and you invited a few relatives over. What Ein's basic philosophy is that you should make a plate for yourself, since you were the one that cooked the meal, and then everybody else should get the plate. It's all about the idea that nobody in this world is really going to help you out, so you have to make sure to help yourself out. And there are many people that'll kind of claim if you help others, it'll make you happy, when in reality, you are just out the time you spent, and while the other party is benefiting greatly, you're using up your time and your effort at the potential that somebody says you might be happy doing this. I feel like that's kind of getting a bit into the philosophy of the fountainhead, but that general theme of selfishness is something that is in all of Ein's writings. So the last major thing I wanted to mention was halfway in between this book. There is information on the Ayn Rand Institute, and in it is a picture of the author herself. I remember when I got to this section of the book, I was utterly stunned to hear that such a monumental book that at one point was selling only second to the Bible was written by a female author. And on top of that, I felt like we had very similar facial features. I do have a little bit of Slavic blood in me, so perhaps that's what I'm seeing. But between Dagny Taggart and the author herself, I had two very strong female role models at a time in my life that I really needed them. It's always interesting whenever I talk about this book. It seems like I get one of 3 responses. Don't think I've ever heard of that one. Oh yeah, isn't that the book that the director of BioShock took a lot of influence from? The author is an evil person, and whoever reads her writings is just as evil. It was mostly because of that third option that I wanted to make this video. Not so much of a, haha, in your face, it's not actually an evil book, but more about the idea that I'm offering a very different perspective. I mean, I can't imagine a whole lot of people have read this book and thought, you know, this feels really empowering for me to be able to transition. But that's what I got out of it. Between this book, as well as the allies that I made along the way, those were some very invaluable tools that was able to help me become the woman that you see before you. So yeah, I can't recommend this book enough. But there is one major, gigantic asterisk that I have to tell anybody that's going to read this book. Part 3, Chapter 7, has this 60-page speech. It's just like that one beach episode in any anime. You could just cut it out, and you'll have lost nothing. As soon as that speech begins, just skip to the next chapter, trust me. You are missing nothing. The speech is mostly just a summary of most of the themes and philosophies that were already discussed throughout. And if you've gotten that far in the book already, you already know them, so you don't have to read them again. Although it is pretty impressive that that speech apparently took the author 2 years to write. And I still very much stand behind the claim that that speech is a lot more epic to see somebody give than it is to actually read about. So then, until next time, be yourself, no matter who that is.